Data visualizations, aka charts and plots. Everybody knows them. They're a key part of data science. There's a subreddit for good ones, a separate subreddit for bad ones, and today I'm going to be going through and ranking 40-something of them on a tier list. Now, to make this flow a little bit better, I have grouped our 40-something visualizations into 7 main categories, and then paired a drink with each of those categories. So that way we can sort of walk through these drinks as we walk through these visualizations, and hopefully things will sort of build up in a way that makes sense. So we're starting off with the most basic of the data visualizations. These are sort of the core building blocks that most of the other ones that we're gonna go through sort of come from. And so as a result, I felt that it was only fitting to start off with what is, in my opinion, the original and most basic cocktail, and that is the Old Fashioned. So for this, we are going to start off with 2 ounces of rye whiskey. Then we're gonna go with a light 1/2 ounce pour of syrup. Now for your standard Old Fashioned recipe, this is going to be simple syrup. I like to do a Demerara syrup for my Old Fashions. It just has a little bit more character and brings a little bit more intrigue to the drink. And then finally, 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. Give that a quick little stir. And there you have it, rye Old Fashioned. This is, again, in my opinion, the simplest of the cocktails. There are cocktails with fewer ingredients, but this is the only one that is actually built in the same glass that you drink it in. So no need for a shaker, no need for a nice stirring glass. Just toss it together in the cup and then enjoy. And because it's so simple, really, the character of this drink is gonna come down to both the whiskey you use, whatever spirit that is, and then the syrup you choose to use, right? Simple syrup's gonna be a bit cleaner. It's really gonna kind of let that whiskey stand on its own. Something like a Demerara is going to bring a little bit of character of its own. You could also use something like a maple syrup if you really wanted to kind of up the flavor that's coming in from your syrup. In this case, because this is a hotter rye, this is a 100 proof or 50% ABV rye, this is a little bit hotter of an Old Fashioned. If you did something like, say, a bourbon, right, like a Buffalo Trace, it'd be smoother, but I personally prefer the rye. And then, of course, you're not limited to whiskey. You can make an Old Fashioned out of basically any spirit, though I would highly recommend sticking with dark spirits like an aged rum or a whiskey. You could certainly do like a Reposado tequila Old Fashioned if you wanted to. It's once you start getting into gins and vodkas that it really starts to break down a little bit. But that is enough talking about drinks. Let's get over to our visualizations and start off with our very first one, the histogram. The histogram is your go-to in terms of plotting the distribution of a single quantitative variable. So you got something you're measuring that has number values, and you just want to see sort of what the shape of that distribution of those number values are. It can be manipulated pretty easily by changing the bin widths. I showed that off a little bit in my previous Brew at the Zoo video. You can see how sort of changing the actual width of the bins can lead to some incorrect assumptions about the data that's underlying that visualization. But overall, as a visualization, 90% of the time, it's gonna give you a really good output. If you just plug it in and, the plotting software will sort of do the calculations on the back end of what parameters make sense. So I think I gotta start off with A tier for it. Actually, that reminds me, I should break down what these actual tiers are and sort of how mentally I'm making the distinction between them. So top tier, S tier, God tier, Tukey's Chosen. These are the absolute best plots at what they do. They're super clean. It's difficult to really draw any sort of incorrect conclusions from the data based off of these plots. Pretty self-explanatory. A tier is for the plots that are perfectly suitable. They will get your point across. They might not have some of the nice refinements of the S tier plots. They might not be totally foolproof, but 90% of the time it is going to do exactly what you need it to do. Everybody's going to understand it. You're not going to have any issues with these A plots. B tier are what I like to call the 80% solution, right? So this is something that as a first draft, it works really well. You can sort of start building off of it, but there's probably a better option for the specific use case that you're looking at for these charts. B tier is also what I have reserved for charts that I just really personally like. C tier, so bit of background context for me. I have a master's in data science, and when I was in undergrad, I actually was a TA for one of the intro data science classes. So C tier is reserved for the plots where, if one of my students in Data 101 had come up to me and, shown me this visualization, I would probably, gently encourage them to look for a different plot, maybe suggest something else that could convey their message a bit better. And if one of my coworkers in the job that I currently work in had come to me with this plot, I would leave a comment in my review telling them to delete it and find a better one. D tier is our last stop before we get to the truly awful plots. These are the ones that are bad options, but I can at least see and understand why you would want to use it, right? They're not the absolute worst of the worst, but you really shouldn't be using these plots if you can help it. And then the F tier plots, aka the MBA material plots, these are not only actively bad plots, these are the ones that reveal an absolute lack of any form of critical thought and suggest that you had probably just thrown something into a large language model and asked it to give you the prettiest, most impressive plot that it could. All right, up next for our basics is the scatter plot. Now, this is really good for when you want to show the relationship between two quantitative variables, all right? So now you've got two different things you're measuring, and you're interested in seeing how the variation in one of those things results in variation in the other thing, right? Very simple. Everybody's seen all of these basic plots, many times over. And the scatter plot really sort of falls into a similar vein as the histogram plot for me. The only reason I'm not putting it in S tier for this one is because I think often scatter plots can end up being too cluttered, where you get, sort of this massive mess of points, and it's not super clear what the actual overall trend is that I'm supposed to be taking away from this data. Plus, often if you have integer value data, what happens a lot in your scatter plot is points end up falling directly on top of each other, and there are ways around this by sort of, jittering the points off slightly. But just as a result of those two things, I have to put it in A tier. It is coming just shy of S tier. All right, next up is the bar chart. The bar chart for me is the epitome of the B tier visual, right? It is totally fine at just getting a quick glimpse of the data, but the horizontal bar chart, which we will see later, is, in my opinion, better in literally every way. And so why use it when you could just use the horizontal bar chart? And there are also countless variants of the bar chart that are better for your specific purposes, right? Grouped bar charts, stacked bar charts. We will get into all of those later in the variant section, but for now, bar chart is going in B tier. Up next, the box plot. This one was literally created by Tukey, one of the sort of founders of data science. So of course, this one has got to go in S tier. Honestly, yeah, I just don't think there's a better chart for showing this kind of data, right? When I've grouped things into my different groups, and I want to compare the distributions of those different groups to each other. There are other ones that we'll see in the variants that sort of build off of this and try to optimize for different things. But in my opinion, your straight up box plot really can't be beaten. And actually, this is a really funny thing. In Tukey's book on data visualization, he actually has a lot of issues with the sort of classical box plot, the way it's constructed as these sort of two rectangles. And so he proposes a bunch of improvements to it, basically trying to strip out as much extra detail from them as possible, trying to basically bring them down to just a few lines. And I really fundamentally disagree with his assertion that these are better plots than your standard box plot. I think, trying to optimize the amount of ink you put on a page was great when you had to physically draw all of your visualizations based off your data. But in our modern era where computers do all the actual plotting for us, I think these things just make them objectively harder to read and understand. Next up, the basic chart for proportions is the pie chart. And if you've at all dipped a toe into the sort of data visualization space, you are aware that there are a lot of issues with pie charts. The sort of most obvious one and the biggest one is that the human brain is really bad at comparing areas of things, especially areas of non-rectangular objects. So comparing those slices of a pie chart, very difficult for the human brain. And so as a result, it has trouble distinguishing whether one proportion is really bigger than another one. You can also have issues with how the proportions are arranged in the chart. Arranging ones on different sides can create sort of different visual impacts. And then there's also the issue of often, pie charts have too many categories, so they're being subdivided up into really, really tiny slices where it's basically impossible to see what the size of that is supposed to be. Overall, there's just so many better alternatives to a pie chart, right? If you're showing proportions, you can use a bar chart. That'll work far better because rectangles easier than triangles. Then if you're really wed to this circular shape, maybe you have, size constraints you're working around, the donut is a far clearer approach, sort of cutting out that middle slice. As a result, pie chart is going to be our first C tier plot. And then last up, our final basic one is the line chart. This, again, to me, is sort of the epitome of the B tier. Again, we are talking about a line chart with only a single line right here. So this is one of those things where, yeah, if you just need to sort of get a quick look at your data, just see what direction it's moving in, absolutely, it'll work for that. But there are just so many better variants of the line chart. In any good conscience, I can't put it any higher than B tier. And so that is our 6 basic visualizations on the chart. As you can see, none of them are D or F tier because just quite simply, when your data visualizations are this simple, it's hard to really screw them up in a meaningful way. With that said, I'm going to finish my old-fashioned, and then we will move on to the variants.